Baby found a bear cub hidden in a tax office vault. What he did next: calculated love. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Ethan Marshall descended the narrow staircase leading to the basement of the Riverside Tax Authority building. His footsteps echoed against the concrete walls, each sound bouncing back to him like a lonely conversation with himself. It was Thursday. The kind of Thursday that felt exactly like every other Thursday he'd experienced in his 12 years working at this office. The manila folders tucked under his arm contained property assessments from 1987, documents that nobody had requested in decades but still needed to be archived properly, according to Regulation 47B of the Municipal Code. The basement always smelled of old paper and dust, a scent that had become as familiar to him as his morning coffee. But today, something was different. There was another smell, faint but distinct, something warm and alive cutting through the staleness. The vault door stood partially open, which was unusual. Harold from maintenance must have forgotten to close it after his inspection last week. Ethan pushed the heavy steel door wider, its hinges groaning in protest. The motion sensor lights flickered to life, illuminating rows upon rows of filing cabinets that stretched back into shadows. He'd been in this vault hundreds of times, knew every corner, every peculiar stain on the floor, every cabinet that stuck when you tried to open it. But as he stepped inside, his breath caught in his throat. There, nestled between boxes of tax returns from the early 90s, was something that absolutely should not have been there. A small brown shape, rising and falling with the rhythm of sleep. At first, his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. Maybe it was a stuffed animal, some elaborate prank by the younger staff members. But then it moved just slightly, a tiny paw stretching out before curling back into the warmth of its own fur. A bear cub. There was a bear cub in the tax office vault. Ethan stood frozen, the folders slipping from his grip and scattering across the floor. The sound should have been loud in the confined space, but somehow it seemed muffled, as if the very air had thickened around this impossible moment. The cub didn't wake. It was so small, probably no more than a few months old, its fur a rich chocolate brown that looked impossibly soft even from where he stood. How did it get here? The question repeated in his mind like a broken record. The building was in the middle of downtown, surrounded by concrete and traffic. The nearest forest was 40 miles away. There were no windows in the vault, no other entrances except the door he'd just walked through. Yet, here it was, breathing steadily, completely at peace in this most unlikely of places. Ethan found himself moving closer, his rational mind screaming warnings that his feet ignored. Bears were dangerous. Even cubs had mothers, protective mothers with claws and teeth. But there was no mother bear here, just this tiny creature alone among the forgotten paperwork of decades past. As he knelt down, careful not to make any sudden movements, he noticed something else. The cub was lying on what looked like a makeshift bed made from shredded documents. Someone had deliberately created this nest. Someone had placed this cub here with care and intention. The papers were arranged in a perfect circle, and in the center, right next to the sleeping cub, was a single sheet of clean white paper with words written in elegant handwriting. Please help him. His name is Calculations of Love. The name didn't make sense, but nothing about this situation made sense. Ethan reached out slowly, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from something else entirely. Wonder, perhaps, or the strange feeling that his life, so predictable and ordered, was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. His fingers barely grazed the cub's fur when its eyes opened. They were the deepest brown he'd ever seen, like looking into pools of liquid chocolate, and in them was an intelligence that made him pull back slightly. The cub didn't panic or cry out. It simply looked at him, steady and calm, as if it had been waiting for him specifically. "Hey there," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. The cub's ear twitched at the sound, but it made no move to run or attack. Instead, it yawned, revealing tiny teeth and a pink tongue, then settled its head back down on its paws, still watching him. There was trust in those eyes, complete and unquestioning trust that Ethan had done nothing to earn. He thought about calling security, about following protocol and reporting this immediately. That's what he should do. That's what any reasonable person would do. But as he sat there on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by the detritus of bureaucracy, looking at this impossible creature that had somehow found its way into his ordered world, Ethan realized he wasn't going to do any of those things. The cub shifted slightly, and Ethan noticed it was shivering. The vault was climate-controlled to preserve documents, kept at a steady 60 degrees that was perfect for paper, but probably uncomfortable for a young animal. Without thinking, he shrugged off his jacket and carefully draped it over the small form. The cub made a soft sound, not quite a growl, more like a contented sigh, and burrowed deeper into the warmth. Ethan found himself smiling, a real smile that he couldn't remember the last time he'd worn. He should be panicking. He should be calling authorities, filing reports, following the endless procedures that governed every aspect of his professional life. Instead, he was sitting on a vault floor, sharing his jacket with a bear cub named after a mathematical concept. As he sat there, Ethan's mind began to work through the puzzle. Someone had put this cub here deliberately. Someone who knew the vault schedule, knew that Ethan specifically would be the one to find it. The handwriting on the note looked familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. The Thursday archive run was his routine, something he'd been doing for years. Whoever left the cub here knew that, counted on it. But why him? He was nobody special, just a mid-level tax assessor who lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment, and whose biggest excitement was usually finding a calculation error in someone's property assessment. The cub stirred again, and this time it crawled closer to him, dragging the jacket along with it. It settled against his leg, the warmth of its small body seeping through his khaki pants. Ethan's hand moved almost of its own accord, gently stroking the soft fur. The cub made that contented sound again, and Ethan felt something inside him, some wall he'd built around his heart without realizing it, begin to crack. He thought about his life upstairs, the cubicle with its neat stacks of papers, the lunch he ate at the same desk every day, the drive home to his empty apartment where he'd microwave a dinner and fall asleep watching documentaries about things he'd never do and places he'd never go. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he asked the cub, who responded by yawning again and closing its eyes. The trust was overwhelming. This wild creature, which should have been terrified of humans, was falling asleep against his leg as if they'd known each other forever. Ethan pulled out his phone, intending to Google what to do when you find a bear cub, but he had no signal in the vault. Of course. The thick concrete walls blocked everything from the outside world. It was just him and the cub, and the silence that wasn't really silence because he could hear the cub's breathing, steady and peaceful. Time seemed to move differently in the vault. Ethan couldn't tell if he'd been sitting there for minutes or hours. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant tune, creating a bubble of timelessness around them. He found himself studying the cub more closely, noticing details he'd missed before. There was a small scar on its left ear, already healed but still visible. Its paws were larger than he'd expect for such a small body, suggesting it would grow to be quite large if it survived, if it survived. The thought made his chest tighten. What chance did a bear cub have in the city? What chance did it have with him, a man who'd never even had a pet because he thought the responsibility would be too much? But as he sat there, feeling the weight of the small creature against his leg, Ethan began to think that maybe responsibility wasn't the burden he'd always believed it to be. Maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe it was purpose. He'd spent so many years following rules, filing papers, calculating taxes, living a life that was safe and predictable and utterly devoid of surprise. And now, here was surprise incarnate, breathing against his leg, trusting him with its life for reasons he couldn't fathom. The note caught his eye again. Calculations of love. What did that mean? Love wasn't something you calculated. It wasn't a number you could arrive at through proper formulas and careful documentation. Or was it? Ethan had always found comfort in numbers, in their certainty and predictability. But maybe whoever left this cub here understood something he didn't. Maybe they knew that even someone who lived his life by calculations could learn a different kind of math, one where the equations didn't always balance and the answers weren't always rational. He carefully reached for the note, trying not to disturb the sleeping cub. The paper was high quality, heavier than standard office stock. The handwriting was distinctive, with loops and flourishes that suggested someone who'd learned penmanship in a different era. As he studied it, a memory tickled the back of his mind. He'd seen this handwriting before, he was sure of it. But where? The vault contained documents going back decades. Could this be connected to something in these old files? The cub stirred, making a small sound of distress in its sleep. Ethan's hand automatically went to comfort it, stroking its fur until it settled again. The gesture felt natural, instinctive in a way that surprised him. He'd always thought of himself as awkward with living things, more comfortable with numbers than with anything that breathed. But here he was, soothing a wild animal as if he'd been doing it his whole life. The cub trusted him, and somehow that trust was teaching him to trust himself. As he continued to pet the cub, Ethan's mind wandered to practical matters. He couldn't leave it here. The vault was no place for a living creature, no matter how strange the circumstances of its arrival. But he couldn't exactly walk out of the building with a bear cub under his arm either. Security cameras covered every exit, and Jerry at the front desk noticed everything. He needed a plan, something that wouldn't raise suspicions or trigger protocols that would end with the cub being taken away to who knows where. His jacket shifted, and he noticed the cub had curled into an even tighter ball, its nose tucked under its tail. It looked so vulnerable, so small in the vast space of the vault. Ethan found himself making a decision that would have seemed insane to him just an hour ago. He was going to protect this cub. He didn't know how or why or what would come next, but he knew with a certainty that surprised him that he couldn't let anything happen to it. The rational part of his brain, the part that had governed his life for 43 years, was surprisingly quiet. Maybe it recognized that some things transcended rationality. Maybe it understood that this was one of those moments that defined a life, that separated who you were from who you could become. The Thursday routine that had brought him down here suddenly seemed like destiny rather than mundane repetition. Every Thursday for 12 years, he'd made this trip. How long had someone been planning this? How long had they waited for the right moment to leave this impossible gift in his path? Because that's what it was, Ethan realized. Not a problem or a complication, but a gift. A chance to be something more than a man who calculated other people's obligations to society. He thought about calling in sick tomorrow, claiming a sudden flu that would keep him home for a few days. But that would be out of character, would raise questions. Ethan Marshall never called in sick. He had accumulated more sick days than anyone else in the office because he never used them. No, he needed to be smarter about this. He needed to think like whoever had orchestrated this situation, someone who understood patterns and routines and human nature well enough to know exactly when and where to place a bear cub for maximum impact and minimum detection. The cub's breathing had deepened into true sleep, completely relaxed against his leg. Ethan carefully pulled out his phone again, not for signal, but to check the time. He'd been down here for almost 2 hours. Soon, someone would notice he hadn't returned from the archives. He needed to go back upstairs, act normal, finish his day as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Then he could return after hours. He had keys, had access. The security guard did rounds, but Ethan knew the schedule. He could make this work. But first, he needed to ensure the cub would be safe until he returned. He carefully lifted it, surprised by how light it was, and settled it back into its nest of shredded documents. The cub murmured in its sleep but didn't wake. Ethan took off his jacket and arranged it around the small form, creating a warm cave. Then he looked around the vault for anything else that might help. In a corner, he found an old cardboard box that once held printer paper. He positioned it to create a shelter around the nest, something that would keep the cub hidden if anyone else happened to come down here, though that was unlikely. The Thursday archive run was the only scheduled visit this week. As he worked, Ethan found himself talking to the sleeping cub, his voice soft and reassuring. "I'll be back," he promised. "Just a few more hours, and I'll figure this out. We'll figure this out together." The words felt strange in his mouth, the "we" especially. He'd been an "I" for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to be part of a "we." But already, after just this short time, he couldn't imagine walking away and pretending this hadn't happened. He stood up, his legs stiff from sitting on the concrete floor, and looked down at his improvised shelter. The cub was completely hidden now, safe and warm. Anyone glancing into the vault would see nothing unusual, just another box among hundreds. Ethan picked up the scattered folders from his entrance, his hands steady now, his mind clear. He had a role to play upstairs, a performance to give. He needed to be the same Ethan Marshall who'd walked down those stairs, the predictable, reliable tax assessor who never caused problems or surprises. But as he reached the vault door, he turned back one more time. The box hadn't moved, gave no sign of the life it sheltered. Yet Ethan knew that everything had changed. In finding this cub, or in being found by it, he'd discovered something he hadn't even known he was looking for. Purpose, connection. The possibility that life could still surprise him, even after all these years of routine and repetition. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step taking him further from the miracle in the vault and back to the ordinary world. But the ordinary world looked different now. The fluorescent lights in the hallway seemed brighter, the sounds of the office more vivid. Jessica Brooks passed him in the hall, offering her usual distracted smile, and Ethan found himself really seeing her for the first time. There were worry lines around her eyes he'd never noticed, a slight stoop to her shoulders that spoke of burdens carried. How many other things had he missed, locked away in his bubble of routine? "Find what you were looking for?" Jessica asked, nodding at the folders in his arms. "More than I expected," Ethan replied, surprised by the honesty of his answer. Jessica gave him a curious look, but continued on her way. Ethan made his way back to his cubicle, settling into his chair with the same movements he'd made thousands of times before. But everything felt different. The spreadsheet on his computer screen, which had seemed so important this morning, now looked like meaningless numbers. How could he care about property tax assessments when there was a bear cub sleeping in the vault, depending on him for its survival? The rest of the afternoon crawled by. Ethan went through the motions, responding to emails, reviewing documents, attending the weekly staff meeting where Harold from maintenance complained about the coffee maker and Susan from human resources reminded everyone about the upcoming fire drill. Normal, mundane, predictable things that now seemed almost surreal in their ordinariness. How could everyone just continue with their day when something impossible had happened just 2 floors below? As 5 o'clock approached, Ethan began to plan. He stopped by the vending machine, buying several bottles of water and some packets of crackers, tucking them into his briefcase. Not ideal food for a bear cub, but better than nothing until he could get something more appropriate. He'd need to research what bear cubs ate, how to care for them. The thought should have been overwhelming, but instead, it filled him with a strange excitement. When was the last time he'd had to learn something completely new? Something that wasn't related to tax codes or filing procedures? Logan Carter from IT stopped by his cubicle just as Ethan was packing up. "Working late again tonight?" Logan asked, though it wasn't really a question. Ethan often stayed late, not because he needed to, but because he had nowhere else to be. "Just need to finish up some filing downstairs," Ethan said, the lie coming easily. "You know how it is, end of the month and all." Logan nodded, already losing interest. "Well, don't stay too late. You know what they say about all work and no play." If only Logan knew, Ethan thought. If only he knew that play had just entered Ethan's life in the most unexpected way possible. He waited until most of the office had cleared out, watching from his window as his co-workers headed to their cars, to their families, to their Thursday evening routines. Soon, the building was quiet, except for the hum of computers in sleep mode and the distant sound of the cleaning crew starting their rounds on the upper floors. Ethan made his way back to the vault, his briefcase heavy with supplies. The stairwell was darker now, the automatic lights taking a moment to respond to his presence. Each step echoed louder in the emptiness, and he found his heart racing with anticipation. What if the cub was gone? What if it had all been some strange hallucination brought on by too many years of routine? But no, as he pushed open the vault door, he could hear it. A soft, snuffling sound coming from the cardboard box. He approached carefully, not wanting to startle the cub if it was awake. As he peered into the box, 2 brown eyes looked back at him, alert but calm. The cub had pushed its way partially out of the jacket, its head poking out like it had been waiting for him. Ethan felt that strange tightness in his chest again, that feeling of connection he couldn't quite name. "Hey there," he said softly, kneeling down. "Miss me?" The cub made a sound that wasn't quite a bark, more like a conversational grunt, and crawled out of the box entirely. It walked over to him on unsteady legs, its gait slightly wobbly but determined. When it reached him, it sat down and looked up expectantly, as if to say, "Well, what's next?" Ethan pulled out one of the water bottles, pouring some into his cupped hand. The cub sniffed at it suspiciously, then began to lap it up with a tiny pink tongue. The sensation tickled, and Ethan found himself laughing, actually laughing, alone in a vault with a bear cub. When was the last time he'd laughed like that? Spontaneous and genuine. He couldn't remember. As the cub drank, Ethan noticed more details about its appearance. Its fur wasn't uniformly brown as he'd first thought, but had subtle variations in shade, darker around the ears and paws, lighter on its belly. There were small scratches on its nose, as if it had been pushing through brush or brambles. But how could that be when it had appeared in a locked vault in the middle of the city? The mystery deepened when Ethan examined the shredded papers that formed the cub's nest. They weren't random documents as he'd initially thought. Each piece had been deliberately chosen, torn from specific files. As he pieced some of them together, a pattern emerged. They were all from the same year, 1987, the same year as the files he'd been sent to archive. More specifically, they were all connected to a single property, a cabin in the mountains that had been seized for back taxes and then mysteriously disappeared from all records. Ethan knew about such disappearances. Usually, they meant someone in the office had made a deal, had taken a bribe to make a property vanish from the system. It was the kind of corruption that everyone suspected existed, but no one talked about. But this was different. As he studied the fragments, he began to see a story emerge. The cabin had belonged to someone named Margaret Chen, a wildlife biologist who'd fought the seizure for years, claiming the land was a crucial wildlife corridor. She'd lost, of course. The city always won such battles. But then, the property had simply vanished from the records, as if it had never existed. The cub had finished drinking and was now exploring the vault, sniffing at various boxes and files with intense concentration. Ethan watched it, wondering if this was somehow connected to Margaret Chen and her lost cabin. Was this her way of sending a message from the past? But that made no sense. The woman would be in her 80s by now if she was still alive. How could she have orchestrated this? As if sensing his thoughts, the cub returned to him, carrying something in its mouth. It was another piece of paper, this one not shredded but carefully folded and hidden beneath the nest. Ethan took it gently from the cub's mouth, unfolding it with trembling fingers. It was a photograph, old and yellowed at the edges. It showed a younger woman standing in front of a log cabin, mountains rising behind her. She was holding a bear cub, not unlike the one now sitting at Ethan's feet. On the back, in the same elegant handwriting as the note, were the words, "Some things cannot be calculated, only felt. Some love cannot be filed, only lived." Ethan stared at the photograph, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind. But the picture they formed was impossible, wasn't it? He looked down at the cub, who was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes. "Are you her messenger?" he asked. "Is that what this is about?" The cub tilted its head, as if considering the question, then did something that made Ethan's breath catch. It stood on its hind legs and placed its front paws on his knee, looking directly into his eyes. In that gaze, Ethan saw something that defied explanation, a depth of understanding that no animal should possess. It was as if the cub was trying to tell him something urgent and important that transcended language. Without thinking, Ethan picked up the cub, surprised again by how natural it felt to hold this wild creature. The cub settled against his chest, its head resting on his shoulder, and Ethan felt that wall around his heart crumble a little more. Whatever this was, whatever strange story he'd stumbled into, he was part of it now. The calculated life he'd built, safe and predictable, was over. In its place was something uncertain and probably dangerous and absolutely wonderful. He stood up, still holding the cub, and made a decision. He couldn't take it home, not yet. His apartment building had strict no-pets policies, and a bear cub was considerably more than a pet. But he couldn't leave it here either. The vault was no place for a living creature, no matter how mysteriously it had arrived. He needed somewhere safe, somewhere temporary while he figured out what to do next. Then he remembered. The old storage building behind the tax office. It had been condemned years ago, scheduled for demolition that never happened because of budget constraints. No one went there anymore, but Ethan had explored it once out of curiosity. There was a room in the back, dry and sheltered, with a door that still locked. It wasn't ideal, but it would do for now. "Come on," he said to the cub. "Let's get you somewhere better." He wrapped the cub in his jacket, creating a makeshift carrier that would hide it from any security cameras they might pass. The cub seemed to understand the need for stealth, remaining perfectly still as Ethan made his way out of the vault and up the stairs. The building was empty now, except for the security guard at the front desk, but there was a back exit that led directly to the old storage building. Ethan had used it before, when he wanted to avoid small talk at the end of a long day. The night air was cool against his face as he stepped outside. The city sounds seemed distant here, muffled by the buildings that surrounded the small courtyard between the tax office and the storage building. The cub stirred slightly, its nose twitching at the new smells, but it remained hidden in the jacket. The storage building loomed before them, its windows dark and broken, giving it a haunted appearance. But Ethan wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, every nerve tingling with awareness. He found the door he remembered, pushing it open with a creak that seemed too loud in the quiet night. Inside, the air was dusty but dry, and moonlight filtered through the broken windows, creating patterns on the floor. The room he remembered was at the back, past old filing cabinets and broken office furniture that looked like the skeletons of prehistoric beasts in the darkness. The door was where he remembered it, and the lock still worked, though it took some effort to turn. Inside, the room was surprisingly clean, as if someone had been maintaining it. There was even an old couch, its fabric worn but intact, and a desk that could serve as a shelter. Ethan set the cub down gently, and it immediately began exploring its new surroundings, sniffing every corner with serious concentration. While it investigated, Ethan pulled out his phone, using its flashlight to better examine the space. That's when he saw them. More photographs tucked into the frame of a broken mirror leaning against the wall. All of them showed Margaret Chen at various ages, always with animals, always in natural settings, but the last one was different. It showed her much older, standing in this very room, smiling at the camera with a knowing look. "You planned all of this, didn't you?" Ethan said to the photograph. "But why me? What am I supposed to do?" As if in answer, the cub returned to him, carrying something else in its mouth. This time it was a leather journal hidden behind the couch. Ethan took it carefully, opening it to the first page. The handwriting was Margaret Chen's, and the first entry was dated just a week ago. "If you're reading this," it began, "then my calculations were correct. You found him, and more importantly, you didn't immediately call for help. That tells me everything I needed to know about you, Ethan Marshall." Ethan's hands shook as he continued reading. She knew his name. She had been watching him, studying his routines, waiting for the right moment. The journal explained everything and nothing at the same time. Margaret Chen was indeed still alive, though very ill. She had rescued the cub from a trafficking ring that sold exotic animals to private collectors, but she was too weak to care for it properly, and she knew she didn't have much time left. "I watched you for months," the journal continued. "Every Thursday, like clockwork, you went to that vault. But it wasn't your punctuality that interested me. It was the way you touched those old files, gently, respectfully, as if they contained real lives and not just numbers. It was the way you ate lunch alone, but always smiled at the pigeons that gathered for crumbs. It was the sadness in your eyes that told me you were waiting for something to matter." Ethan had to stop reading, his vision blurring. How had this stranger seen him so clearly when he'd barely seen himself? The cub, perhaps sensing his distress, climbed into his lap, its warm weight comforting. He stroked its fur absently as he continued reading. The journal detailed Margaret's plan, meticulous in its execution. She had been a volunteer at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center 40 miles away, the same one that would normally handle a case like this. But she knew the cub was special, knew it needed something more than standard rehabilitation. It needed someone who would understand that not everything valuable could be quantified, that some things required faith rather than facts. The cub's mother was killed by the traffickers, Margaret had written. But before she died, she did something I've never seen before. She looked at me, really looked at me, and I swear she was asking me to save her baby. Not just its life, but its spirit. That's when I knew I couldn't just hand it over to the authorities. It needed someone who could love it with the kind of calculated dedication that you bring to everything you do, Ethan. Someone who could plan and prepare and protect with the same intensity you bring to those dusty files. The mention of calculations brought Ethan back to the note. Calculations of love. Now he understood. Margaret had seen in him someone who approached everything with careful consideration, who could bring that same intensity to caring for this cub. She had calculated that his loneliness, his routine, his hidden capacity for gentleness would make him the perfect guardian. And she had been right. The journal went on to provide practical information: what to feed the cub, how to care for it, contact information for a veterinarian who would help without asking too many questions. But more than that, it told the story of Margaret's life, her fight to protect wildlife corridors, her battle with the city over that cabin that had mysteriously disappeared from records. She had won that battle, it turned out. Not through legal channels, but through careful manipulation of the very system Ethan worked within. The cabin still existed, hidden in the mountains, a sanctuary she had maintained for 40 years. When the time is right, she had written, you'll know to take him there. The land remembers its purpose even when the city forgets. But first, he needs to grow strong, and you need to remember what it feels like to care about something more than numbers on a page. Ethan looked at the cub, who had fallen asleep in his lap, completely trusting. He thought about his apartment, his routine, his safe and predictable life. Then he thought about Margaret Chen, who had seen something in him he hadn't seen in himself. She had trusted him with this impossible secret, this wild responsibility, and somehow, sitting in this abandoned building with a bear cub in his lap and a stranger's journal in his hands, Ethan felt more like himself than he had in years. The city sounds seemed very far away as he sat there, planning. He would need supplies, lots of them. Formula for the cub, proper bedding, toys to keep it stimulated. He would need to research bear behavior, understand what he was really taking on. He would need to be careful, strategic, everything Margaret had calculated he could be. But more than that, he would need to open his heart in a way he'd closed it off years ago. After too many disappointments and too much loneliness had made him retreat into the safety of routine. The cub stirred in its sleep, making small sounds that might have been dreams. Did bears dream? Ethan realized he didn't know, realized there was so much he didn't know. But for the first time in his adult life, that didn't frighten him, it excited him. Every day would bring new challenges, new discoveries, new moments of connection with this incredible creature that had been placed in his path by a woman who saw him more clearly than he saw himself. As the night deepened around them, Ethan made mental lists of everything he would need to do. Tomorrow, he would call in sick for the first time in 5 years. He would drive to the pet store 3 towns over where no one would recognize him, buy supplies meant for large dogs that would work for a small bear. He would transform this abandoned room into a proper sanctuary, temporary but comfortable. He would begin the strange double life that Margaret had planned for him, mild-mannered tax assessor by day, secret bear guardian by night. But tonight, he would simply sit here with the cub sleeping trustingly in his lap, feeling the weight of this new responsibility and the lightness it somehow brought to his spirit. Margaret's journal lay open beside him, its pages full of wisdom and warnings. Love and calculations. She had written about the intelligence of bears, their capacity for memory and emotion, their ability to form bonds that transcended species. She had written about the specific challenges of raising an orphaned cub, the need for consistency and patience, the importance of not trying to make it a pet, but respecting its wild nature even while protecting it. "He will teach you as much as you teach him," she had written in one entry, maybe more. Bears understand things humans have forgotten, about seasons and cycles, about when to rest and when to act, about the fierce protection of what matters most. Listen to him, Ethan. He has messages for you that no tax form could ever contain. The cub's paw twitched in its sleep, and Ethan found himself wondering what it was dreaming about. Its mother, perhaps? The forest it had barely known? Or was it dreaming of new things, of the strange man who had found it in an impossible place and decided to change his whole life to keep it safe? He would never know for sure, but that uncertainty no longer bothered him. Some things, he was learning, didn't need to be calculated or filed or understood completely. Some things just needed to be felt. As the hours passed, Ethan found himself talking to the sleeping cub, telling it about his life, his routines, his dreams that had gotten smaller and smaller until they fit perfectly within the confines of a cubicle. He told it about his parents, gone now for 10 years, and how he'd thrown himself into work to avoid dealing with the grief. He told it about the promotion he'd turned down because it would have meant managing people, and he didn't think he was good with living things. He told it about all the Thursday nights he'd spent alone in his apartment, watching documentaries about places he'd never go and lives he'd never live. "But that's changing now, isn't it?" he said softly, stroking the cub's fur. "You've changed everything, just by existing, just by being here where you shouldn't be, trusting me when you have no reason to. Margaret was right. You're not just a bear cub, you're a catalyst, aren't you? A calculation she made to save both of us." The cub sighed in its sleep, a sound so human it made Ethan's chest tight with emotion. He thought about all the people in his life who had tried to draw him out of his shell. Jessica Brooks had invited him to happy hour countless times, always graciously accepting his polite refusal. Logan Carter had tried to get him interested in the office softball team, convinced that Ethan had hidden athletic abilities. Even Harold from maintenance had attempted conversation about things beyond broken coffee makers and burnt-out light bulbs. But Ethan had resisted all of it, safe in his bubble of solitude. Yet here was this bear cub, not trying to change him but simply needing him, and somehow that need had broken through all his carefully constructed walls. Margaret Chen, a stranger who had observed him from afar, had understood what no one else had. Ethan didn't need to be pushed into social situations or forced into human connections. He needed to be needed, purely and simply, by something that wouldn't judge his awkwardness or question his choices. The journal contained more than just instructions and philosophy. There were stories about other animals Margaret had saved over the years, each one teaching her something different about resilience, about trust, about the wild intelligence that existed beyond human understanding. She wrote about a fox with 3 legs who had learned to hunt more efficiently than any 4-legged fox she'd known. She wrote about an owl who had lost an eye but could still spot a mouse in total darkness. She wrote about survival and adaptation, about the incredible capacity of wild things to overcome impossible odds. "Your cub is special," she had written in an entry dated 3 days ago. Not just because of his circumstances, but because of what he represents. He's the last of something, Ethan. The traffickers who killed his mother were part of a ring that's been destroying bear populations for decades. selling cubs to collectors who want exotic pets. But this one escaped that fate because his mother fought back, because she died protecting him. He carries her courage in his genes, her determination in his blood. He deserves a chance to grow up free, to eventually return to the wild and continue his line. But first, he needs to survive, and for that, he needs you. The weight of this responsibility should have terrified Ethan, but instead, it grounded him. For so long, he'd been floating through life, untethered to anything meaningful. Now he had purpose, clear and urgent. This cub needed him, not in some abstract way, but literally for survival. Every decision he made from now on would matter in ways that no tax assessment ever could. As dawn began to creep through the broken windows, painting the room in soft grays and pinks, Ethan knew he needed to move. The cub would wake soon, hungry and needing more than the meager supplies he'd brought. He needed to get to that pet store, needed to transform this space into something livable. But for just a few more minutes he sat there, holding this impossible gift, feeling the rise and fall of its breathing against his chest. The city was waking up around them. He could hear the first buses of the morning rumbling past, the distant sound of coffee shops opening their doors, the world returning to its predictable rhythms. But here, in this abandoned room, with a bear cub in his lap and a dead woman's journal beside him, Ethan existed outside those rhythms, in a space between the calculated and the wild. The cub stirred, its eyes opening slowly, blinking in the soft morning light. It looked up at Ethan with that same trusting gaze, and he felt his heart expand in ways he hadn't known were possible. "Good morning," he whispered. "Ready for our first full day together?" The cub yawned, showing those tiny teeth again, then climbed out of his lap and padded over to the corner of the room, clearly looking for a place to relieve itself. Even in this, there was intelligence, an understanding of cleanliness that surprised Ethan. He quickly grabbed some old newspapers from a pile in the corner, creating a makeshift bathroom area. The cub used it immediately, then looked at him as if to say, "See? I'm trainable." "You're remarkable," Ethan told it, and meant it. "Margaret was right about you. You're special." The cub made that conversational grunt again, then began exploring the room in the morning light, its movements more confident than they'd been the night before. It investigated every corner, every shadow, mapping its new territory with serious concentration. Ethan watched, fascinated by its methodical approach. It was almost like watching himself assess a property, thorough and systematic. His phone buzzed, reminding him of the real world waiting outside this bubble. It was his alarm, telling him he should be getting ready for work. For the first time in his professional life, Ethan Marshall was going to lie. He called the office's automated sick line, his voice carefully hoarse as he reported a sudden flu. The lie felt strange on his tongue, but also liberating. He was choosing something other than routine, other than predictability. With that done, he turned his attention to the immediate needs. The cub needed food, proper food. Margaret's journal had listed several formula recipes that would work until the cub could transition to solid food. He would need bottles, the kind used for orphaned wildlife. He would need blankets, toys, maybe a small pool for water play. The list grew in his mind, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt energized. This was a different kind of calculation, planning for life instead of taxes. "I'll be back soon," he told the cub, who had found a patch of sunlight and was sitting in it, looking remarkably content. "Few hours at most. Will you be okay?" The cub tilted its head at him, then deliberately walked over to the couch and climbed onto it, curling up in a ball. The message was clear. "I'll be fine. Go do what you need to do." Ethan left the building carefully, checking to make sure no one was around to see him emerge from the condemned structure. The morning air was crisp, carrying the smell of autumn beginning to turn toward winter. He would need to think about heating for the room, about making it comfortable as the weather grew colder. But that was a problem for later. Right now, he had shopping to do. The drive to the pet store 3 towns over took 40 minutes, time Ethan used to mentally prepare his story. He had a sick dog, very sick, needed special supplies. The lie felt more comfortable the more he rehearsed it, especially because it was partially true. He did have a sick animal, just not a dog. The pet store was just opening when he arrived, and he had the place almost to himself. He filled a cart with bottles, formula ingredients, blankets, toys designed for large puppies that would work for a small bear. The teenage clerk didn't question his purchases, too sleepy to care about anything beyond scanning barcodes and making change. On the drive back, Ethan found himself thinking about Margaret Chen's cabin in the mountains, the one that had disappeared from city records. According to her journal, it was still there, hidden but maintained, waiting. She had written detailed directions, not using roads or official landmarks but natural markers. A distinctive rock formation, a stream that ran uphill for a short distance due to an underground spring, a grove of aspens that grew in a perfect circle. It sounded like something out of a fairy tale, but then, finding a bear cub in a tax office vault was fairly tale-like too. The cub was exactly where he'd left it, curled on the couch in the patch of sunlight that had moved, but which the cub had followed. Its ability to adapt, to make itself comfortable in strange surroundings, continued to amaze him. When it saw him, it made a sound that was definitely happy, padding over to investigate the bags he'd brought. "Patience," Ethan said, laughing as the cub tried to stick its head into one of the bags. "Let me get organized first." He set up a feeding station in one corner, a sleeping area in another, a play space in the middle of the room. The cub watched all of this with interest, occasionally padding over to sniff at something new, but mostly just observing. There was something almost human in its patience, its understanding that Ethan was doing all of this for its benefit. When he finally prepared the first bottle of formula, following Margaret's recipe exactly, the cub's demeanor changed entirely. It became all baby animal, eager and clumsy, trying to grab the bottle with paws that weren't quite coordinated enough for the task. Ethan had to sit on the floor, the cub in his lap, holding the bottle at just the right angle. The cub drank greedily, its eyes closing in contentment, one paw resting on Ethan's hand as if to say, "Don't go anywhere." "I'm not going anywhere," Ethan assured it. "We're in this together now." As the cub fed, Ethan thought about the future. Margaret's journal suggested the cub would need at least 6 months of care before it could even begin to be prepared for life in the wild. 6 months of double life, of sneaking between his apartment and this abandoned building, of maintaining his normal facade while secretly raising a bear. It should have seemed impossible, but Ethan had spent his entire adult life doing things that seemed impossible to others, finding joy in tax forms, living alone without loneliness, or so he told himself, existing in routine without going insane. The cub finished the bottle and immediately fell asleep again, its belly full and round. Ethan settled it in the nest of blankets he'd created, then sat at the old desk to read more of Margaret's journal. The later entries were more urgent, written with a hand that shook slightly. She knew she was dying, knew she was running out of time to find the right person for this task. "I considered so many others," she had written. "Wildlife rehabilitators who would have known exactly what to do, activists who would have understood the importance, but they all would have done things by the book, would have involved authorities, would have put the cub into a system that doesn't understand that some things can't be systematized. I needed someone who could work outside the rules while still being methodical, someone who could be both parent and protector, teacher and student. I needed someone who could calculate love. There it was again, that phrase. Ethan was beginning to understand what she meant. Love wasn't just an emotion. It was a series of actions, decisions, sacrifices. It was calculating the right formula, maintaining the right temperature, providing the right environment. It was planning and preparing and protecting. It was everything Ethan had always been good at, just applied to something alive instead of something administrative. The morning turned to afternoon as Ethan worked to make the space more comfortable. He found an old space heater in the tax office's maintenance closet that no one would miss, borrowed extension cords that had been forgotten in storage, slowly transformed the abandoned room into something approaching a home. The cub woke periodically, watched him work for a while, then went back to sleep. It was still very young. Margaret's journal suggested maybe 3 months old, and needed lots of rest. As he worked, Ethan found himself humming, something he hadn't done in years. It was an old song his mother used to sing while cooking, something about roads and choices and taking the one less traveled. Appropriate, he thought, considering the path he'd just chosen. The conventional road would have been to report the cub, let authorities handle it, go back to his routine. But here he was constructing a secret sanctuary in an abandoned building, preparing to raise a bear cub based on instructions from a dead woman he'd never met. When his phone rang, the sound was jarring in the quiet space. It was Jessica Brooks from the office, and for a moment Ethan panicked. Had they discovered something? Noticed something off about his sick day? But her voice was concerned, not suspicious. "Just wanted to check on you," she said. "It's so unlike you to call in sick. Do you need anything? Soup? Medicine?" The kindness in her voice made Ethan's throat tight. "I'm okay," he said, trying to sound congested. "Just need rest, but thank you, Jessica, really." There was a pause, and then Jessica said, "You sound different, Ethan. Not sick different, just different. Are you sure you're okay?" Ethan looked at the cub, who had woken up and was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes. "I'm better than okay," he said honestly. "I'm finding my way." "That's cryptic," Jessica laughed. "But good. You've seemed so isolated lately. More than usual, I mean. We worry about you, you know. The office wouldn't be the same without our reliable Ethan." After she hung up, Ethan sat thinking about her words. People worried about him. People noticed him, even when he tried to be invisible. Maybe he hadn't been as successfully isolated as he'd thought. Maybe his walls hadn't been as impermeable as he'd believed. The cub padded over to him, sitting at his feet and looking up expectantly. It was learning his moods already, sensing when he needed comfort. Ethan reached down and picked it up, surprised as always by how natural it felt to hold this wild creature. "She's right, you know," he told the cub. "I have been isolated, but not anymore. You've changed that, haven't you? You've connected me to something larger than myself." The cub made its conversational grunt, then settled against his chest, content to be held. Ethan thought about all the documentaries he'd watched about bears, how they were portrayed as solitary, dangerous, unpredictable. But this cub was none of those things. It was social, gentle, surprisingly consistent in its behaviors. Maybe the documentaries had gotten it wrong. Maybe bears, like people, were more complex than their stereotypes suggested. As afternoon turned to evening, Ethan established a routine. Feeding every 3 hours, playtime in between. Lots of holding and gentle contact that Margaret's journal said was crucial for orphaned cubs. The cub was remarkably adaptable, already learning the schedule, already understanding that Ethan was its source of food and comfort and safety. During one of the play sessions, the cub did something that stopped Ethan cold. It stood on its hind legs and placed its paws on Ethan's shoulders, looking directly into his eyes. Then it leaned forward and touched its nose to his, a gesture so deliberately affectionate that Ethan felt tears spring to his eyes. This wasn't just an animal following instincts. This was a creature capable of connection, of choosing to show affection. "I love you too," Ethan whispered, the words feeling strange but right. When was the last time he'd said those words to anyone or anything? When was the last time he'd felt them this purely, this uncomplicated by human complexity? The cub dropped back to all fours and returned to playing with a rope toy Ethan had bought, as if the moment of connection had been just another part of their routine. But Ethan knew better. That had been a choice, a deliberate communication of trust and affection. Margaret had been right. The cub was special, not just in its circumstances but in its capacity for connection. As night fell again, Ethan knew he needed to return to his apartment, maintain the appearance of normalcy. He'd set up everything the cub would need for the night: food that could be accessed easily, water in a shallow bowl that couldn't be tipped over, toys for entertainment, blankets for warmth. But leaving felt wrong, felt like abandonment, even though he knew the cub would be fine. "I'll be back first thing in the morning," he promised, kneeling down to the cub's level. "Before anyone else is awake, I'll be here." The cub watched him prepare to leave, its expression unreadable. Then it did something that nearly broke Ethan's resolve. It picked up one of the toys, the rope toy it had been playing with, and brought it to him, dropping it at his feet. It was sharing, offering its favorite thing as if to say, "Take this so you'll remember to come back." Ethan picked up the toy, his vision blurring. "I'll bring it back tomorrow," he promised, "and every day after that, you're not alone anymore." Neither of us is. Senkai chapters of Part 1 completed. The drive home felt surreal, the normal world seeming strange after 2 days in the bubble of the abandoned building. His apartment, when he finally reached it, looked different somehow. Smaller, emptier, less like a home, and more like a storage unit for a life he wasn't really living. The rope toy sat on his kitchen counter, a reminder that everything had changed, that tomorrow would not be like yesterday. That routine had been replaced by something wild and wonderful and terrifying. Ethan barely slept that night, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. He thought about the cabin in the mountains, about Margaret Chen's legacy, about the future that stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer empty. He thought about the cub, alone in the abandoned building, trusting that he would return. He thought about calculations of love, about how sometimes the most important things in life couldn't be quantified or filed or understood through logic alone. When his alarm went off at 4 a.m., Ethan was already awake, already dressed, already heading for the door. He stopped at a 24-hour grocery store, buying fresh supplies and ingredients for the formula. The clerk, half asleep at the register, didn't even look at him twice. He was just another early morning customer, invisible in his ordinariness. If only they knew, Ethan thought. If only they knew what extraordinary secret he carried. The cub was awake when he arrived, sitting by the door as if it had been waiting. When it saw him, it made a sound that was definitely joy, rushing over and climbing up his leg until he picked it up. The reunion, after only 8 hours apart, felt like coming home. "Miss me?" Ethan asked, laughing as the cub nuzzled against his neck. "I missed you too, more than you know." He returned the rope toy, and the cub carried it around proudly for several minutes before abandoning it in favor of breakfast. As Ethan prepared the formula, he found himself talking to the cub about his plans for the day. He'd need to return to work, maintain his cover, but he'd come at lunch and again after work. He'd establish a pattern that wouldn't raise suspicions. "We can do this," he told the cub, who was focused entirely on the bottle. "It won't be easy, but we can make it work. And someday, when you're stronger, when you're ready, we'll go to that cabin. We'll find the place Margaret saved and you'll learn to be wild, but not yet. For now, you need to be safe, and I need to learn how to keep you that way." The cub finished eating and climbed into his lap, settling there with complete trust. Ethan stroked its fur, feeling the steady heartbeat against his hand, and knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because this cub had awakened something in him that he hadn't even known was sleeping. As the sun rose over the city, painting the abandoned building in golden light, Ethan Marshall sat with a bear cub in his lap and felt, for the first time in years, truly and completely alive. The calculated life he'd built was over. In its place was something incalculable, something that couldn't be filed or assessed or reduced to numbers on a page. It was messy and uncertain and probably dangerous. It was also wonderful. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure if he was talking to the cub, to Margaret Chen, or to the universe that had conspired to bring them together. "Thank you for finding me." The cub yawned, showing those tiny teeth, then settled more deeply into his lap. Outside, the city was waking up, people beginning their predictable routines, their calculated days. But here, in this abandoned room that had become a sanctuary, Ethan Marshall was learning a different kind of calculation, one that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with love. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and exhilarating. Ethan became an expert at living two lives, the boring tax assessor who went to work every day, and the secret guardian who spent every free moment with a rapidly growing bear cub. He learned to read the cub's moods, understanding the different sounds it made for hunger, playfulness, and affection. He learned that it loved water, but hated being dried off afterward, that it preferred to sleep touching him somehow, even if just a paw against his shoe, that it had a particular fondness for butternut squash that seemed almost comical in its intensity. The cub grew stronger every day, its coordination improving, its personality becoming more distinct. It was clever, almost unnervingly so, figuring out how to open containers and solve simple puzzles Ethan created for enrichment. It was also mischievous, hiding Ethan's belongings and then watching with what could only be described as amusement as he searched for them. But most of all, it was affectionate, constantly seeking physical contact, always wanting to be near him. Jessica Brooks noticed the change in him first. "You seem different," she said one day at lunch, studying him across the break room table. "Happier. Did you meet someone?" In a way, Ethan thought she was right. He had met someone who had changed everything. "Something like that," he said, unable to suppress a smile. "That's wonderful," Jessica said, her own smile genuine. "You deserve happiness, Ethan. We all do. But you, especially. You've been alone too long." If she only knew how not alone he was now, Ethan thought. Every moment away from the office was spent with the cub, teaching it, learning from it, building a bond that grew stronger every day. He'd even given it a proper name, though he still thought of it as the cub most of the time. Oliver, he'd called it, after Oliver Twist, another orphan who'd found an unlikely guardian. The abandoned building had been transformed into a proper habitat. Ethan had installed battery-powered lights, created climbing structures from old furniture, even set up a small pool for Oliver to play in. He'd become friends with the veterinarian Margaret had mentioned in her journal, Dr. Sarah Kim, who made house calls and asked no questions beyond what was necessary for Oliver's health. "He's thriving," Dr. Kim said during one visit, watching Oliver play with a ball. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. I've seen orphaned cubs in professional facilities that didn't look this healthy." But Ethan knew it couldn't last forever. Oliver was growing fast, would soon be too large to hide, too strong to contain in the abandoned building. Margaret's journal had laid out a timeline, a plan for gradual reintroduction to the wild, and that time was approaching. The cabin in the mountains was waiting, had always been waiting. One evening, as autumn deepened toward winter, Ethan sat with Oliver and showed him pictures from Margaret's journal. Pictures of mountains, of forests, of other bears living wild and free. Oliver studied them with that intense concentration he brought to everything, touching the photos gently with his paw. "That's your future," Ethan told him. "That's where you belong. Not here in this city, but out there, where your mother came from, where you can be what you're meant to be." Oliver looked at him then, those brown eyes holding a depth of understanding that still took Ethan's breath away. Then the cub climbed into his lap, settling there as he had that first day, as if to say, "Not yet, I'm not ready yet." And neither was Ethan. The thought of saying goodbye to Oliver, even knowing it was the right thing, made his chest ache in ways he hadn't felt since his parents died. But that was still months away. For now, they had this, their secret world in an abandoned building, their calculated love that had become incalculable, their bond that defied explanation but needed none. The first snow of winter came early that year, thick flakes that covered the city in white and made everything look clean and new. Ethan brought Oliver outside for the first time, late at night when the streets were empty, letting him experience snow. The cub's reaction was pure joy, rolling in it, trying to catch flakes on his tongue, leaving paw prints that Ethan carefully obscured afterward. "Your first snow," Ethan said, watching Oliver play. Margaret would have loved to see this. He'd been thinking about Margaret Chen more often lately, this woman he'd never met but who had changed his life so completely. Her journal had become his guide, not just for raising Oliver but for living differently. She'd written about courage and compassion, about fighting for what mattered even when the odds were against you, about finding purpose in unexpected places. "You saved us both," Ethan told her photograph one night. "Oliver and me. You saw what we needed before we even knew we needed it." The weeks turned to months, and Oliver grew from a small cub into something more substantial, more bear-like. His play became rougher, his strength more apparent. He could climb anything, solve increasingly complex puzzles, and had developed a sense of humor that manifested in elaborate pranks. But he never used his strength against Ethan, never forgot the gentleness that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Dr. Kim was impressed by Oliver's development. "He's going to be magnificent when he's full grown," she said. "But Ethan, you know you can't keep him here much longer. He needs space, needs to learn to forage, needs to be a bear." "I know," Ethan said, watching Oliver investigate a new toy. "Spring. When the weather warms, we'll go to the cabin. Margaret left instructions, maps. There's a whole ecosystem there waiting for him." "And what about you?" Dr. Kim asked gently. "What will you do after?" It was a question Ethan had been avoiding. His life had become so intertwined with Oliver's that he couldn't imagine returning to his old routine. The thought of going back to just being a tax assessor, of living in his empty apartment without purpose, seemed impossible. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe that's okay. Maybe not knowing is part of the journey." As winter deepened, Ethan began preparing for the transition. He studied Margaret's maps, planned the route to the cabin, researched bear behavior in the wild. He also started teaching Oliver skills he would need: how to forage for food, how to fish, using a kiddie pool and toy fish at first, how to be wary of certain dangers. Oliver learned quickly, his intelligence making up for his lack of natural education from his mother. One particularly cold night, as they sat together in the warmth of the space heater, Oliver did something new. He had been growing more independent, spending time playing alone, exploring on his own. But tonight he brought Ethan a stick he'd been chewing, dropped it at his feet, and then sat back expectantly. "You want to share?" Ethan asked, touched by the gesture. Oliver pushed the stick closer with his nose, then looked at Ethan with those expressive eyes. It was an invitation, a request for connection that had nothing to do with food or play or any immediate need. It was simply a desire to share something, to be together in the moment. Ethan picked up the stick, examined it seriously, then handed it back. "It's a very good stick," he said solemnly. "Thank you for sharing." Oliver made his happy sound, then settled next to Ethan, not in his lap as he used to, but beside him, as an equal rather than a dependent. It was a subtle shift, but Ethan recognized it for what it was. Oliver was growing up, becoming his own being while still maintaining their bond. The incident with the stick became a nightly ritual. Oliver would bring something, a toy, a pine cone he'd found, once a particularly interesting piece of paper, and they would share it, examine it together, acknowledge its value. It was their way of saying, "I love you," without words, a calculated expression of an incalculable emotion. Logan Carter from IT noticed Ethan's transformation too. "You're different," he said one day, cornering Ethan by the coffee machine. "You smile now. Real smiles, not those polite things you used to do." "What's your secret?" "No secret," Ethan said, though of course his entire life had become a secret. "Just finding purpose, I guess." "Purpose?" Logan repeated thoughtfully. "Yeah, that'll do it. Changes everything when you find your why, doesn't it?" It did, Ethan reflected. His why was currently probably demolishing something in the abandoned building, but that destruction was part of growth, part of becoming. Every day with Oliver was a gift, even the difficult ones, even the ones where he worried he was doing everything wrong. Margaret's journal had become worn from reading, its pages soft and familiar. He'd memorized passages, carried her wisdom with him through the days. One entry in particular resonated as spring approached. The hardest part of love is letting go. But sometimes, letting go is the greatest act of love there is. To release something wild back to wildness, to resist the urge to possess and control. To trust that the bond you've built transcends physical proximity. This is the calculation that matters most. Love multiplied by freedom equals something infinite. Ethan knew she was right. As much as he loved Oliver, as much as Oliver had become the center of his world, the cub deserved to be free. Not free from their bond, which would always exist, but free to be what nature intended. The cabin in the mountains wasn't an ending but a transformation, a new chapter in both their stories. The day Ethan decided it was time, Oliver seemed to know. The cub, though he was hardly a cub anymore, was restless, pacing the confines of their sanctuary with an energy that couldn't be contained. When Ethan arrived that morning, Oliver was standing at the door, looking out through a crack at the world beyond. "You're ready, aren't you?" Ethan said softly. "You know there's more out there, more than I can give you here." Oliver turned to him, and in his eyes was not accusation but understanding. He padded over to Ethan, stood on his hind legs, and placed his paws on Ethan's shoulders as he had done months ago. But this time, he was nearly as tall as Ethan, his strength evident but controlled. They stood there, eye to eye, and Ethan saw in those brown depths the wild intelligence that had always been there, now ready to be fully expressed. 1 week, Ethan promised. 1 week to prepare, and then we go. That week was a blur of activity. Ethan took vacation time he'd never used, prepared his apartment for a long absence, gathered supplies for the journey. He also said subtle goodbyes to coworkers, nothing that would raise suspicion but enough to provide closure if he decided not to return. Jessica Brooks seemed to sense something. "You're going somewhere," she said, not a question but a statement. "Somewhere important." "How do you know?" Ethan asked. "Because you look like someone about to be set free," she said. "Whatever it is, wherever you're going, I hope you find what you're looking for." "I already have," Ethan told her. "Now I'm helping it find what it's looking for." The night before they left, Ethan and Oliver sat together in their sanctuary one last time. The abandoned building had been their world, their secret, their safe space where impossible things became possible. Tomorrow, they would leave it behind for something larger, wilder, more uncertain. "Thank you," Ethan told Oliver, who was leaning against him, a warm presence in the darkness. "Thank you for choosing to trust me, for teaching me to trust myself, for showing me that love doesn't always follow logical calculations." Oliver made his conversational grunt, then did something he hadn't done in months. He climbed into Ethan's lap, or tried to. He was far too big now, but he managed to get his upper body there, his head resting on Ethan's shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, neither wanting to break the moment, both understanding that everything was about to change. The drive to the mountains took 6 hours. Ethan had rented a large van, creating a comfortable space in the back for Oliver. The bear watched the passing landscape with intense interest, his nose pressed to the window, taking in the gradual transformation from city to wilderness. As the buildings gave way to trees, as the air became cleaner and the sky wider, Oliver grew more animated, more alert. "You remember this, don't you?" Ethan said, glancing back at him. "Not specifically, but in your bones, in your DNA. This is home." The directions to Margaret's cabin were precise but unconventional. Turn left at the rock that looks like a sleeping bear. Follow the stream that runs uphill. Look for the circle of aspens. It was like following a treasure map, each landmark bringing them deeper into wilderness, further from the world Ethan had always known. When they finally found it, the cabin was exactly as Margaret had described, but somehow more. It was small but solid, built with logs that had aged to a silver gray, surrounded by wilderness that stretched in every direction. But it wasn't abandoned. The roof was intact, the windows clean. Someone had been maintaining it. As Ethan parked and let Oliver out, a woman emerged from the cabin. She was elderly, but moved with purpose, her eyes bright and knowing. She looked at Oliver, then at Ethan, and smiled. "You must be Ethan," she said. "I'm Margaret Chen." Ethan's world tilted. "But you're dead," the journal said. "The journal said what it needed to say to motivate you," Margaret said, her smile widening. "Would you have taken this on if you'd known I was alive? Would you have bonded with Oliver the way you did if you thought someone else could do it?" Ethan wanted to be angry, but looking at Oliver, who was cautiously exploring his new surroundings while keeping Ethan in sight, he couldn't be. The deception had led to the most important relationship of his life. "You calculated this," he said, "all of it." "I calculated the possibility," Margaret corrected. You and Oliver made it reality. Love can't be forced, Ethan. It can only be given the opportunity to grow. That's what I did. Created an opportunity. You did the rest. She invited them into the cabin, which was simple but comfortable, filled with books and photographs and evidence of a life dedicated to wildlife. Oliver investigated everything, his excitement palpable but controlled. This place smelled right to him, Ethan could tell. It smelled like home. "I've been preparing," Margaret said, gesturing to the landscape outside. "There's a female bear who comes through regularly, young, healthy. Oliver's not ready for that yet, but in time, there are fish in the stream, berries on the mountainside, everything he needs to learn to be wild. But it will take time, patience. You can't just release a hand-raised bear and expect it to survive." "How long?" Ethan asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "As long as it takes," Margaret said. "Months, maybe a year. You'll need to stay, help him transition. Are you prepared for that?" Ethan looked at Oliver, who had found a patch of sunlight and was lying in it, completely at peace. He thought about his apartment, his job, his old life. Then he thought about who he'd become since finding Oliver. The person Margaret had somehow seen hidden beneath years of routine and isolation. "Yes," he said simply, "I'm prepared." Margaret smiled, and in that smile was the satisfaction of a calculation completed, a plan fulfilled. "Good. Then let me show you what I've prepared. This isn't just about releasing Oliver. It's about creating a sanctuary, a place where the wild things we've pushed to the margins can find safety. I'm old, Ethan. I need someone to continue this work. Someone who understands that the most important things can't be reduced to numbers on a page." As she led him outside to show him the feeding stations, the cameras for monitoring wildlife, the careful infrastructure she'd built over decades, Ethan felt the last pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Margaret hadn't just given him Oliver to raise. She'd given him a purpose, a mission, a reason to leave his calculated life behind for something incalculable. Oliver followed them, no longer the tiny cub who'd fit in Ethan's lap, but not yet the fully wild bear he would become. He was in between, transitional, like Ethan himself. They would make this journey together, from domesticated to wild, from calculated to free. That night, as Ethan sat on the cabin's porch with Oliver beside him and Margaret inside making tea, he thought about the note that had started it all. Calculations of love. He understood now that love itself was the calculation, the only math that mattered. You took the risk, multiplied it by trust, added patience and dedication, and somehow arrived at something infinite. The stars above were clearer than he'd ever seen them, unmarred by city lights. Oliver was alert, watching the darkness with interest, but not fear. Somewhere out there were other bears, the life Oliver was meant to live. But for now, for tonight, they were exactly where they needed to be. "Thank you," Ethan whispered to the universe, to Margaret, to the impossible sequence of events that had brought him here. "Thank you for calculating that I needed this." Oliver made his conversational grunt and leaned more heavily against Ethan's leg. In the distance, something howled. A coyote, perhaps, or a wolf. Oliver's ears perked up, but he didn't move. There would be time for wildness, time for him to answer that call, but tonight, he was content to be what he was, a bear caught between two worlds, loved in both, free to choose his path. Margaret came out with the tea, handing Ethan a mug that smelled of pine and honey. "The first few weeks will be the hardest," she said. "Oliver will want to follow you everywhere, and you'll want to let him. But gradually, he needs to learn independence, Not abandonment, just independence. "How do you know when it's time?" Ethan asked. "How do you know when to let go?" Margaret looked at Oliver, then at the wilderness beyond. "You'll know," she said simply, "the same way you knew to pick him up that first day. The same way you knew to change your entire life for him. Trust your instincts, Ethan. They've gotten you this far." As the weeks passed, Ethan learned the rhythms of the mountain, the patterns of wildlife, the delicate balance Margaret had maintained for decades. Oliver grew stronger, more confident, began exploring further from the cabin each day. The female bear Margaret had mentioned appeared one morning, watching Oliver from a distance with curious eyes. Oliver was interested but uncertain, not yet ready for that level of wildness. Ethan documented everything, taking over Margaret's detailed journals, adding his own observations. He wrote about Oliver's first successful fishing attempt, about the day he found a bee's nest and learned the hard way about stings, about the gradually increasing time he spent alone in the forest. Each milestone was bittersweet, a step toward the inevitable separation that was the goal of everything they'd done. Margaret taught Ethan about the other animals she monitored, the network of wildlife advocates she worked with, the constant battle against development in hunting and human encroachment. It was a different kind of calculation than he'd ever done, measuring success not in numbers but in lives saved, habitats preserved, connections maintained. "You were a tax assessor," she said one day, watching Ethan work with Oliver on foraging techniques. "You understand systems, regulations, bureaucracy. That knowledge is valuable here too. Someone needs to fight the paperwork battles, understand the legal frameworks, protect this place through proper channels as well as direct action." Ethan realized she was right. His old life hadn't been wasted, just misdirected. The skills he'd developed in years of routine could be repurposed for something meaningful. He could be the bridge between the wild and the civilized, someone who understood both languages. The day Oliver didn't come back to the cabin at sunset was the day Ethan knew everything had changed. He waited on the porch, watching the forest darken, fighting the urge to go searching. Margaret sat with him, silent support in the face of necessary heartbreak. "He's okay," she said quietly. "The cameras show him near the stream, fishing. He's just choosing to be a bear tonight." They stayed up all night, Ethan unable to sleep without knowing Oliver was safe. At dawn, Oliver appeared at the edge of the clearing, looked at the cabin for a long moment, then turned and walked back into the forest. He'd made his choice, but he'd wanted Ethan to know he was all right. "That's love," Margaret said, tears in her eyes. "That's calculated love. He's free, but he'll never forget you." Oliver came back 3 days later, stayed for an afternoon, then left again. This became the pattern, increasingly long absences punctuated by brief visits, each one a gift, a reminder that their bond transcended proximity. The female bear began appearing when Oliver was around, and gradually, tentatively, they began to interact. "He's courting," Margaret laughed one day, watching Oliver attempt to impress the female with a particularly large fish. "Badly, but he's trying." Ethan felt like a proud parent, which he supposed he was. He'd raised Oliver from a tiny cub to this magnificent creature, now finding his place in the wild. The calculation was complete, the love successfully multiplied by freedom to create something infinite. 1 year after arriving at the cabin, Ethan made a decision. He called the tax office, spoke to Jessica Brooks, who had somehow become the person he trusted most from his old life. "I'm not coming back," he told her. "I found what I was looking for, and it's here." "I knew you would," Jessica said, and he could hear her smile. "We'll miss you, but Ethan, you sound alive. Really alive. That's worth everything." He stayed at the cabin, taking over more of Margaret's work as she grew frailer. Oliver visited less frequently, but always seemed to know when Ethan needed him, appearing after particularly difficult days as if summoned by emotional gravity. The female bear, whom they'd named Grace, was pregnant, and Margaret predicted Oliver was the father. "The circle continues," she said, satisfaction in her voice. "His line will go on, wild and free, because you had the courage to love him enough to let him go." The cubs were born in late winter, 3 of them, tiny and perfect. Oliver brought Grace and the cubs to the clearing one spring morning, presenting his family to Ethan like a proud father. They stayed just long enough for Ethan to see them, to understand that Oliver remembered, would always remember, then disappeared back into the forest. "That's your legacy," Margaret told Ethan. "Those cubs exist because you saved Oliver. Every generation that follows, every bear that carries his genes, they're all part of the calculation of love you completed." Margaret passed away peacefully that summer, leaving the cabin and the mission to Ethan. He buried her in the grove of aspens, the ones that grew in a perfect circle, and continued the work. Other orphaned animals found their way to him, through the network Margaret had built, through what seemed like cosmic coincidence but was probably careful planning by people who understood that some things couldn't be systematized. Ethan became known in certain circles as the man who could calculate love, who could take the broken and abandoned and help them find their way back to wholeness. He never forgot his first calculation, though. Oliver visited less frequently as years passed, but each visit was precious. A reminder of how a bear cub in a tax office vault had changed everything. One day, nearly 5 years after that first impossible discovery, Oliver appeared in the clearing with a cub of his own. A young male with the same intelligent brown eyes. Oliver sat at the edge of the forest and watched as the cub cautiously approached the cabin, drawn by curiosity. Ethan sat perfectly still on the porch, hardly breathing, as the cub came closer. When the young bear was just a few feet away, Oliver made a sound, not quite a bark, more like a conversational grunt. The cub looked back at his father, then at Ethan, then did something that made Ethan's eyes fill with tears. He sat down, tilted his head, and looked at Ethan with an expression of trust that was achingly familiar. "Hello," Ethan whispered. "I knew your father when he was your size. He was brave and smart and taught me everything important about love." The cub made a small sound, not afraid, just acknowledging. Then Oliver stood, grunted again, and the cub followed him back into the forest. But the message was clear. The story continued, the calculation of love multiplying through generations, creating something that transcended individual lives. Ethan sat on the porch long after they'd gone, thinking about Margaret Chen, about the impossible journey that had brought him here, about the life he'd built in the mountains. His old colleagues at the tax office probably wondered what had happened to him, the reliable Ethan Marshall who'd disappeared into the wilderness. If they only knew that he'd found his purpose in the most unlikely place, learned the most important calculation of his life from a bear cub named after a concept he was still trying to fully understand. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ethan heard something in the distance. It was Oliver, calling out in the gathering darkness, a sound that carried across the wilderness and straight to Ethan's heart. It wasn't a goodbye or a hello, just a reminder. I'm here. You're here. We're connected across this distance by something that can't be calculated but only felt. "I love you too," Ethan called back, not caring if anyone heard, not caring if it made sense. Some things didn't need to make sense. Some things just needed to be true. He went inside the cabin, lit the lanterns, and opened Margaret's last journal, the one he was now filling with his own observations. He wrote about the visit, about Oliver's cub, about the continuation of something that had started with an impossible discovery in a vault. As he wrote, he thought about everyone who'd played a part in this story. Margaret, with her careful planning. Jessica, with her persistent kindness. Dr. Kim, with her quiet support. Even Logan Carter, who'd noticed when Ethan had started to really smile. They'd all been part of the calculation. Factors in an equation that had produced something beautiful. But the most important factor had been Oliver himself. A small bear cub who'd trusted completely, loved unconditionally, and taught Ethan that the most valuable things in life couldn't be filed or assessed or reduced to numbers on a page. The work continued. Other animals came and went, each with their own story, their own journey back to wildness. Ethan became skilled at reading their needs, understanding their fears, helping them bridge the gap between human care and wild independence. But Oliver remained special. The first calculation, the one that had changed everything. Years passed. Oliver grew old for a wild bear, his visits becoming rarer but no less precious. His offspring thrived in the mountains, carrying forward his genetic legacy and perhaps something more, a memory of kindness, a trust in the possibility of connection across species boundaries. Ethan grew older too, his hair graying, his movements slower, but his purpose never wavering. One winter morning, Ethan found Oliver in the clearing, lying in the snow, breathing labored. He was old, tired, had come home one last time. Ethan sat with him in the snow, stroking the fur that had once been rich brown and was now streaked with silver, talking softly about their shared history, their impossible bond, their calculated love that had become incalculable. "You saved me," Ethan told him. "You know that, right? I thought I was saving you, but you saved me. From emptiness, from routine, from a life that was all calculation and no love. You taught me that the best things can't be measured, can only be felt." Oliver's breathing slowed. His eyes focused on Ethan with that same trust he'd shown as a cub. He lifted one massive paw, placed it gently on Ethan's knee, a gesture that echoed across the years to that first day in the vault when a tiny cub had chosen to trust a lonely man. "It's okay," Ethan whispered, tears freezing on his cheeks. "You can let go. You're home, you're loved, you're free. The calculation is complete." Oliver's eyes closed for the last time as the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the clearing in golden light. Ethan sat with him until the cold became too much, then covered him with branches and snow, a natural burial for a creature who'd lived between two worlds but belonged fully to the wild. That night, Ethan heard Oliver's offspring calling in the distance, their voices carrying on the wind like a tribute. The calculation of love continued, multiplied through generations, creating ripples that would extend far beyond any individual life. Oliver was gone, but what he'd represented, what he'd taught, what he'd begun, that was eternal. Ethan opened a new journal that night and began to write. Not observations about wildlife, but the full story from the beginning. The impossible discovery in the vault, the terror and wonder of those first days, the gradual building of trust, the journey to the mountains, the painful beauty of letting go. He wrote it all, every detail he could remember, because stories like this needed to be told, needed to be remembered, needed to inspire others to take impossible chances on improbable love. As he wrote, he could almost feel Oliver beside him, that warm presence that had defined so many nights. The cabin felt empty but not lonely, filled with memories and purpose and the knowledge that love, properly calculated, never really ends. It just transforms, multiplies, becomes something larger than its original components. The story ended where it began, with a man alone but not lonely, surrounded by the evidence of a life transformed by an impossible encounter. Ethan looked at the photograph Margaret had left, the one of her younger self with a bear cub, and understood now that this had always been bigger than just him and Oliver. It was about the connections that transcend logic, the love that defies calculation, the wild things that teach us to be human. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the mountains in white, hiding Oliver's final resting place beneath a blanket of peace. But somewhere out there, his children and grandchildren continued the story, wild and free, carrying in their genes and perhaps their memories the echo of a love that had started in a tax office vault and expanded to encompass the world. Ethan closed the journal, turned off the lantern, and sat in the darkness, listening to the wilderness that had become his home. He was old now, would probably join Oliver soon enough. But the work would continue. He'd already found his successor, a young woman who'd brought him an orphaned fox and stayed to learn. The calculation of love would go on, multiplying through generations of both humans and animals, creating something infinite from something that had once seemed impossible. "Thank you," he whispered one last time to Oliver, to Margaret, to the universe that had conspired to teach him that the most important calculations couldn't be done with numbers. "Thank you for everything." In the distance, a bear called out in the night, and Ethan smiled. The story continued, would always continue, as long as there were people willing to take impossible chances on improbable love, willing to calculate not with their heads but with their hearts, willing to trust that some things transcended logic and lived instead in the realm of wonder. The cabin settled into sleep. The mountains stood eternal watch, and somewhere in the wilderness, Oliver's legacy moved through the forest, wild and free and forever loved. The calculation was complete, but the love was infinite, spreading outward in ripples that would never end, touching lives in ways that could never be measured, only felt. And in that infinite expansion, in that uncalculable multiplication of love, Ethan Marshall found what he'd never known he was looking for. Not just purpose or connection, but the truth that the most important things in life couldn't be filed or assessed or reduced to numbers. They could only be lived fully and completely, with a heart open to the impossible and a spirit willing to be transformed by wonder. The story of the bear cub in the tax office vault had become legend in certain circles, told in whispers by people who understood that miracles came disguised as problems, that love came disguised as responsibility, that the greatest calculations were the ones that couldn't be solved but only experienced. And at the heart of every telling was the same truth. Sometimes the most extraordinary things happen in the most ordinary places, waiting for someone ordinary to make the extraordinary choice to care. Ethan lived another 10 years after Oliver's passing, 10 years of continuing the work, of saving other orphaned creatures, of teaching others the calculation of love. When he finally passed, peacefully in his sleep, they found him at his desk, working on one final journal entry. It read simply, "The calculation is complete. The love is infinite. The story continues." They buried him beside Margaret in the grove of aspens, and on the day of his burial, 3 bears appeared at the edge of the clearing. Oliver's descendants, come to pay respects to the man who'd saved their bloodline. They stayed just long enough to be seen, to be remembered, then disappeared back into the wilderness where they belonged. The cabin became a sanctuary, officially recognized and protected, managed by the woman Ethan had trained and others who understood the mission. They called it the Oliver Foundation, and its purpose was simple: to bridge the gap between wild and tame, to save what could be saved, to multiply love through calculated acts of compassion. And somewhere, in filing cabinets and hard drives and the memories of those who'd known him, the story of Ethan Marshall lived on. The tax assessor who'd found a bear cub in a vault and discovered that the most important calculations had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with love. The man who'd learned that sometimes the most profound transformations came from the most unlikely encounters. The human who'd proven that love, properly calculated, could transcend species, transcend death, transcend every barrier except the ones we build in our own hearts. The story ended, but it also continued, rippling outward in waves of influence and inspiration. Every person who heard it carried it forward, modified by their own understanding, multiplied by their own capacity for wonder. And in that multiplication, in that endless calculation of love spreading through the world, Oliver and Ethan achieved immortality, not of body but of impact, not of presence but of purpose.